our off schedule, sorry, War Hamster, next installment of Secret Societies. And I am here with War Hamster Brady, who is leading us on our investigation of the Skull and Bones Secret Society and what the overall implications are, not just to the United States, but to the world in general, and then how that kind of meets, because it meets often with Operation Gladio and the different people that's been steering us towards this strategy of tension. How are you doing, Brady?
I am wonderful. Happy Sunday.
And when are you leaving?
We fly out to the Bahamas on Wednesday morning.
I'm so jealous.
Yeah, it's
so
nice.
Happy for you guys.
Yeah, it should be fun. And I've been freezing my butt off all winter here in New Hampshire, so I could definitely use some 80-degree weather.
Mr. San Diego meets New Hampshire, wants to be in Florida, and is going to the Bahamas.
I have survived this winter somehow, and the ice is finally starting to melt, so I don't have to worry about eating, what, when I walk out to my car. Today's going to be fun. Going on with our ongoing theme to dive into secret societies, most specifically Skull and Bones, we've got some more modern connections. We're in the 1940s today, or 30s and 40s, I think. And there's a few names we're going to do today that aren't household names, but maybe they should be. And we're going to go a little bit off the beaten track because of their connections and tell some really big stories. And as usual, the Colonel doesn't know which people I'm going to highlight, but I'm just going to tee her up for her to just, knock it out of the park with the stuff that she's been talking about for ad nauseam for what, 2 years now.
Yeah.
So this should be a fun one. You ready to rock and roll?
Yes, I am.
And we even have some people in the chat already. Hey, everyone. Even though we're off schedule. And obviously I will not be here next Thursday, but I will be here the Thursday after. So we'll get back on schedule. Big picture, our thesis has been, obviously Operation Gladio and associated endeavors shows an amazing amount of coordination at some very high levels in the corridors of the halls of power. And we're starting to look into secret societies to see who's actually pulling those puppet strings. And we started to go into the Skull and Bones, and just an amazing amount of coincidences. These people all know each other, they marry each other, and they just somehow pass off one job to the other. And it's an amazing system. It's got to be the best networking group of all time, at the very least. And today we're going to look at some of that things you would not expect. Or would you?
I would.
You might. You got a suspicious mind, though. First name I want to bring up is a guy by the name of Al Hesburgh, Hessberg. He didn't do anything too special. He's a lawyer in Albany. He was eventually the president of the Albany County Bar Association, capital of New York. I guess that's sort of important. He probably knew some important people. But the only reason I bring him up is he was the very first Jewish member of Skull and Bones in 1938. He's also the first standout Jewish football player at Yale University. And there was a movie, I forget the name of it, semi-based on this guy's life. The reason that's important is, we hear people in our corner of the internet talk all the time about, the Jews run the world. If that's the case, and Skull and Bones was setting up all these, different things for a century before they allowed their first Jewish member, how do they rule the world? Did these Eastern establishment blue blood families just step aside and open their doors? That didn't happen. So the truth is, there's some Jewish banks and some very powerful Jewish people that have got a disproportionate amount of power per population in the big boy table that decides everything that runs the world. But no, the world is not run by Jews. It's run by a bunch of people that have very insidious plans for where we're going. And those plans are for the New World Order. And the reason Skull and Bones is called The Order, there's a reason George H.W. Bush gave a speech talking about the New World Order. And the date of that was, September 11th, 1991, 10 years before the planes hit New York.
Yes.
Yeah. So I bring up Hesburgh because just to make that argument. This is not a Jewish thing. It is not a purely Puritan thing. This is the way the world works. There's where the most rich and powerful families throughout history have pulled the puppet strings on humanity. And that's the story we're telling. Good start.
Yes. And understand that we have found the American Bar Association in general in some very inconvenient places as it relates to Operation Gladio. Now, New York being the hub of the Northeast Blue Bloods, Albany being the hub of New York from a government perspective, and this guy is running the County Bar Association. So while some people may think that that's insignificant, it is not insignificant at all.
Yeah, I mean, they decide who gets to practice law. They have a lot of influence on how the law is practiced. You've seen it during the lawfare engaged against President Trump, how they've threatened to debar pro-Trump lawyers just for representing him.
And speaking of that, that goes right to the heart of every appellate judge in the state of New York, every Supreme Court judge, because they create rosters.
How's that work?
Well,
go into more depth. Go into more detail there. That's interesting.
Well, just like for the Supreme Court, you have all of these judicial, like they have to have a rating for the from the Bar Association on whether they're, whether they warrant further review to be even referred to as a judge. Now, again, when you're in a state capital, everything runs. I mean, the entire thing is lawmaking. That's what they do. And the lawyers that advise the non-lawyer representatives and senators are all looking to the local bar association for recommendations on who to hire for this or that. This guy is going to have way more authority or a status than what most, even like Tallahassee. The local bar authority there is going to have sway, but you're in New York, and that is going to be like the breeding grounds for the Federal Reserve and the lawyers that represent all of these Wall Street firms is all going to be it's almost like the termites, they just start spawning out of a colony, and he's going to be one of the sources of those.
And what you're suggesting is he's a gatekeeper.
That's exactly what I was just thinking.
Yeah, you just described. Yeah, it's very good. Can you give me 1 second? I've got to go off camera for about 10 seconds so I can sneeze without.
Sure. And I just want to emphasize the point that Brady made. I have come across more and more people, and I think the more and more misunderstanding that is going on about what's happening in Washington, D.C., and people, all of the different camps of what they think it portends, this stovepiping of people and blame and everything else is going to get more heated. But I can tell you one thing, if you come into my comments and the only thing that you can add is blaming a religion, you're not going to get any engagement with me.
No.
So,
I get where they're coming from. It's just a really simplistic worldview, and it doesn't hold up under scrutiny. It's the same thing. The same thing you get with the Khazarian mafia. There is some truth to it, but it's not the full picture. The world is a lot more nuanced than that suggests.
Well, we've already made we've documented the Catholic Church involvement in all of this, the Protestant Church under the Rockefellers' involvement in all of this. It isn't.
Yeah, Skull and Bones is all about the Puritans, and the early Protestant movement in America. It's 100% where these people come from.
It is. All religions have been infiltrated. There are good and bad people in them all. And you need to just basically leave it at that if you're going to have an intellectual conversation.
Yeah, that's well put. All right, let's jump into our next Bonesman, because this gets kind of fun. And this could be an interesting sidebar, but it's part of a really big picture. Where do I have this guy's picture? Because he's worth looking at. This is a guy by the name of William Welch Kellogg.
Oh,
And
I know him.
do you? I didn't know if I was going to catch you by surprise today or not. Oops, where'd he go?
Let me know when you got his picture up.
Hang on. It's coming up right now. I got too many windows open. This is Mr. Kellogg right there. Kind of looks like a wannabe. God, who's the guy I'm thinking of? The actor from the 70s.
He
Robert.
looks like Captain Kangaroo.
I was trying to give him a little more credit. Who is that? Gosh darn it. How did I forget this guy's name? Anyway, this is Mr. Kellogg. Why do we care about him? Well, I'm glad you asked. This is one of the world's first, and I'm using air quotes here, climatologists. Guy's born in a place called New York Mills, New York, so Eastern Seaboard. Goes to private school at Brooks School in Massachusetts. So that's a boarding school. Yale, Bonesman class of 1939, which all these guys right around now, obviously getting out of college right when World War II is going on, they're going to be involved. So that's going to be a continuing theme. He goes to graduate school in Berkeley, but it gets interrupted by the war. So he goes to work for the Air Force, and he serves in their brand new meteorological program. He's a pilot. He's the guy who collected some of the first data on the dynamics of thunderstorms, and does this by flying B-25s into the heart of storms. So we've all kind of heard that story. This is the guy who did it. After the war, he goes back to California and gets his PhD from UCLA. Here's where it gets fun. His first job is he joins the RAND Corporation, capital R, capital A, capital N, capital D.
Also known as the CIA front.
Well, absolutely. And more. And we're going to jump into we're going to talk about the RAND next, because it's a fascinating history. The RAND Corporation starts out as where we heard this before, a nonprofit global policy think tank, research institute, and public sector consulting firm. What could possibly go wrong here?
They produce all of the documents that they're going to later use as justification to change laws or create policy.
Yeah. So wait. There's some real good details here. So what does the RAND Corporation do? Well, it really helped early. It's one of the earliest think tanks. It helps U.S. policy decisions in things like the space race after Sputnik in 1957.
Helps them.
Yeah. Really helped it. Helped shape policy on the Vietnam War, the U.S.-Soviet nuclear arms confrontation, the Great Society welfare programs. The RAND Corporation was all over that, writing papers and supporting it. Nationalized healthcare. This is the RAND Corporation in the 60s, the 50s and 60s.
A propaganda machine.
Yeah. So Project RAND, it came out of World War II, which is basically the U.S. Army Air Forces established something called Project RAND, R-A-N-D. And it's always capitalized. And RAND stands for Research and Development. That's where the name came from. Its initial objective was to investigate long-range planning of future weapons.
In other words, justify the military-industrial complex.
Absolutely. And of course, one of the co-founders, the biggest sponsors originally was Douglas Aircraft Company. Now, why is that so funny? Go ahead. There's so much with Douglas.
Because, I mean, you can't make this shit up. So, and this is one of my favorite foot stomping points. This was started in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And people still believe the bullshit that Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex. When did Eisenhower leave? Did he not? Wasn't he not president during the majority of the 50s when the military-industrial complex was actually created? And that people think he was warning us? No, he fucking created it, and then was basically telling us that he did it on his way out the door with things like RAND. Go ahead. Sorry.
Exactly. No, that's exactly right. The hypocrisy. People say that, one of the tools of the devil or whatever, he's got to tell you what he's doing.
Yeah.
That's exactly what you just described.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So we're past Douglas Aircraft Company. The big Douglas Aircraft Company, they got a contract through the RAND Corporation to research intercontinental warfare. Sounds Sounds very peaceful. So the original Project RAND becomes the RAND Corporation, and they expands into some civilian fields because they've got to have their fingers in every pie. Those civilian fields include education, international affairs, gun policy. There's something called a RAND health insurance experiment. We don't have to dive into that, but it's as bad as you can imagine. They got involved in child policies, criminal justice, national security, intelligence policy, population studies. Oh, yeah. So we're talking about Malthusianism, depopulation, all that kind of stuff is now in play with the RAND Corporation, who's whispering in the ears of all of our politicians and corporations. They're involved in counterterrorism, and they even get involved in arts policy. So RAND is the think tank involved in everything. It's one of the original ones. These people, these are big league players in RAND, and this guy is one of the initial founders. Mr. Kellogg is.
Now, if you were to go back over every single one of those categories, I could change the label at the top and mark RAND out and put CIA.
Yeah, that's probably accurate. With yes. I don't even know if there's an exception to that. I'll just take that. Yeah.
Because the CIA used think tanks like RAND in order, and again, it was the Carnegie, it was the Rockefeller Foundation, it was all of these. They use these think tanks to generate papers in order to justify what they're already going to do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. All right, let's go a little deeper into RAND. One of their first major funders, private funders, was a guy by the name of Frederick S. Pardee, Pardee. If you live in California, you know the name Pardee because the Pardee Corporation built almost all of the tract homes in San Diego. In fact, I think my parents bought one of the Pardee homes, but they're everywhere. It's a very wealthy corporation. That's the same family. But they create this thing called the Frederick S. Pardee RAND Graduate School. This is one of the 8 original graduate programs in what's called public policy. So these people like Victoria Nuland, all these government people, they go to these graduate schools for these think tanks in what's called public policy. This is where the whole technocracy comes from. And of course, this one, the Pardee RAND Graduate School, is the very first to offer a PhD program in public policy. If you go look at a lot of these unelected bureaucrats have been running their country for the last 40 or 50 years, you're going to find an awful lot of them came from the Pardee RAND Graduate School. So that's kind of important. And this is this guy we're talking about right here, Mr. William Welch Kellogg, is one of the founders of this RAND program.
So what's important about that is that, remember, the CIA embeds CIA agents into these schools as recruiters. And so as these people are accepted into these programs, some of the professors, some of the staff members, some of the deans are actual CIA agents. And they are grooming people to hire them, and they import foreigners in there in order to be able to recruit them as well and groom them to go back to their countries to spy on their countries for them.
Yeah, and I'm not going to go into any detail on this on the air, but we've talked about my experience with a college CIA recruiter. It is very real. I've seen it firsthand. Yes. It is 100% real, what she just described. I've lived it. I've seen it.
Yeah.
Sorry, I can't. I'm not willing to share all those details. I don't think that'd be the smartest thing to do. Let's talk about more. RAND is the company, is the think tank that wrote the paper about mutually assured destruction under McNamara when he was Secretary of Defense. They wrote a paper called On Thermonuclear War. That's the title. And their idea, what's called winnable nuclear exchange. The guy who did that, and remember this name because he'll come up again, is Herman Kahn, Kahn. Do you remember Dr. Strangelove?
Yes. That
was modeled after Herman Kahn. And if you go watch the movie again, they don't call it RAND Corporation. It was called the Bland Corporation. They spelled it with all caps, just like RAND does, BLAND. So they stole RAND Corporation as the bad guy, the villain, and used Bland Corporation. That actually happened.
That's hilarious.
So let's talk about some of their other donors. How about that? This is weird to me. Allstate Insurance and State Farm Insurance put a lot of money into this think tank. Now, of course,
Why do you think that's weird?
You wouldn't think that. Well, first of all, insurance companies are supposed to invest to handle their long-term liabilities. And this doesn't seem like a prudent investment on a pure balance sheet standpoint. But what are they doing there? Why are they putting money into this? Because it's shaping public policy.
Correct.
Yeah. Another funder. This is one's going to shock you. The Ford Foundation.
Said no one ever.
Yeah. The only shocker here is that Rockefeller's name didn't come up already, or the Carnegies. The U.S. Army and Air Force have put a lot of taxpayer dollars to the RAND Corporation. So they are not private. They get government grants, a ton of them.
So I know a lot of people that have retired from the Air Force and went to work for RAND. RAND was big. MITRE was big, all out in Los Angeles at Space Systems Division, because as you pointed out, the Kellogg guy was big into the whole satellite meteorology. We had an entire, that's how I have heard of him. One of the programs that was still classified when I worked out there, it's no longer classified, was the Defense Meteorology Satellite. And a lot of the information that this guy had, the studies and information that this guy was used as a basis for some of the scientific requirements for that system. So yeah, all of this is very big, and RAND is very big in the space business.
Yeah. So a couple comments I want to touch on in the chat. The chat's outstanding today. Mager Sarge wrote, we're talking about the guy Khan. He said he also wrote On Escalation, and he went on to SRI and the Hoover Institute. Great contribution. That is absolutely. I mean, this Khan is he's a big deal. He wasn't a bonesman, so we're not going to go into too much depth, but very well. And Renee in the chat asks, are they connected to the Tavistock Institute? The answer is yes, but not directly. I'm sure there's been a lot of incestuous. There's been people who've probably been on the Tavistock Institute. For those who don't know, the Tavistock Institute, which we will be talking about as part of this series, because that's a big part when you start talking about. We start talking about the British connection. That's where the Tavistock Institute comes in, and they are one of the most important players in the 20th century doing what's called social engineering. So, great question, Renee. Is there a direct connection? Like, do they share funds? No, they'd be separate, but I'm sure they go to the same conferences and parties. And I bet if we went and looked, we would find a number of people that have worked at both think tanks, as well as other ones like the Hoover Institute. It is very incestuous in that world. So good job, chat. Okay, continuing on. Oh, did I mention this? Recently, they got a $570 million grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for something called Intensive Partnerships for Effective Teaching. What do you think they were teaching?
Social emotional learning.
Yeah, something along those. Exactly. I would have said it a little bit more crudely, but well done.
Well, but that's the actual name. It was Castle was created by a Rockefeller sister, and it's actually the kind of like the seed for social emotional learning as a program, and it has been deployed throughout the entire United States.
Yeah, and that dates all the way back to Horace Mann bringing the Prussian education model that teaches you obedience to the state in the 1850s. So that's all part of the one. That's a whole show in and of itself. Yeah. All right, so of course you can't have a think tank this big without having some USAID funding, right?
Correct.
And the funding started in the 1960s. As of 2021, the RAND Corporation, which is supposed to be some kind of a nonprofit think tank, got $279 million out of their whole $357 million, so close to 80% in that ballpark, from the U.S. government, including the DoD, HHS, DHS, National Science Foundation, State Department, and USAID.
Doesn't seem very non-governmental to me.
No, not at all. It's almost like it's a cutout, so they could do things they can't do overtly. They do it covertly. Yeah,
just like that.
Boy, are you detecting a pattern here?
I am. I am.
Boy, you're sharp today, Colonel. All right, let's go through some of the alumni of RAND, because this is how big of a deal RAND is, and it's not a household name, and it should be. You remember the Air Force General Hap Arnold? That's where he came from.
Actually, I've been in Hap Arnold's base house on March Air Force Base, where he was the wing commander. Out in the Los Angeles basin.
Next one I've got from RAND is Paul Baran. He's the guy basically that one of the lead people that started with ARPANET, which is what we're on right now, which is called the internet. Yeah, that came out of RAND too. Guy by the name of Samuel Cohen. You know that name?
Neutron bomb.
Boom. Bingo. Well done. Karen House, who happens to be the president of Dow Jones and was the president of Dow Jones and Company, which owns the Wall Street Journal, among others. A little bit of influence, huh? Horace Gaither, the guy who wrote the Gaither Report. Have you run into that? I think you probably have. You may not recall.
I have had a couple of sources on the Gaither Report. I don't know anything about him.
Yeah, this is all I know is that he wrote the Gaither Report, but that's about the 1957 Soviet nuclear attack theory.
Yeah.
A few others. Scooter Libby.
Okay.
For those who don't know, that's Dick Cheney's chief of staff. One of the biggest warmongers in history, came from the RAND Corporation. One of my favorites is Harry Markowitz. You familiar?
No.
I bet you ran across him when you were studying economics, but this is the guy who wrote the papers on modern portfolio theory. Every investment advisor in the world knows Harry Markowitz. Talked about modern portfolio theory. By the way, Markowitz was dead wrong. The markets are not efficient. They're efficient eventually, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But so I had to bring him up. I've been arguing against Markowitz my entire professional career.
Henry Kissinger too.
I've got him. He's at the bottom. He was the last one on the list. You jumped ahead.
Okay, sorry.
That's all right. You're allowed. It's your show. Guy by the name of Ratan Tata. That's the Indian Tata Sons. It's one of the biggest. I think it's the richest family in India.
No way. They're opium dealers.
Is that where they made their original wealth?
Yes.
Opium? That would fit another pattern.
Yes, I just did a thread on them like a month ago.
Well, he's one of them, and he came from the RAND, or he went and worked with the RAND Corporation.
Whoa. Wow. Okay.
How many of these families started out in the opium business? We are ruled by pirates, people. I'm telling you, it is piracy. That's why Skull and Bones is the pirate flag.
That's exactly right.
Yes. All right. Have you ever heard the name of Abram Shulsky?
No.
He was the director of the Pentagon's Office of Special Plans. That name came up over the weekend, Office of Special Plans, and we'll get back to that. But this is the guys who did these guys who did the report on the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And Seymour Hersh absolutely destroyed Shulsky. Just destroyed him in articles. And Seymour Hersh ended up being right about a lot of stuff. He's a great reporter, whether you agree with him or not.
That's true.
All right. Here's a name you know and love, Margaret Mead. The heroine of the feminist movement from the 60s. Yeah, she came from RAND. So think about that. All the different fields that these people are writing think tank papers on that are influence our politicians and decision makers, they all come from RAND. And this whole thing we already talked about, they're involved with social engineering. This is Margaret Mead sitting there writing these feminist pieces that shaped the last 3 or 4 decades. All from this one little think tank. And 3 last names that we all know and love that came from there. Condoleezza Rice, Donald Rumsfeld, and mic drop, Henry Kissinger.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a crazy list.
Uh-huh. Pretty influential.
That is a crazy list.
Yeah, I thought it was worth talking about. So back to our boy, William Welch Kellogg, because he is important. There's something that happens, and again, here's my favorite year, 1971, called the Study of Man's Impact on Climate, SMIC. It happened in Sweden in 1971. Why Sweden? Kellogg's one of the two people writing this study. He's one of the first climatologists. This is where your entire global warming alarmism, climate alarmism comes from. This guy is one of the guys. He's right there. So he does this study on man's impact on the climate, primarily funded by MIT. It was built on an earlier study called the Study of Critical Environmental Problems, SCEP. Kellogg's now at something called the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Remember, he's doing all the weather testing by flying planes. And he writes a report that emphasized carbon dioxide and aerosols are the biggest threat to the climate. Now, we know how the aerosol science turned out. It turned out to be completely false. That whole hole in the ozone layer, all that stuff. Yeah. And this study that Kellogg writes is the predecessor to one of the biggest events in world history that nobody talks about is the Stockholm Conference in 1972. Now, the reason Kellogg gets brought to the Stockholm Conference, or the guy who brings him there, I wish I had some music to play, because here comes the villain. Darth Vader walks in the room. Enter a guy that I've talked about before, Maurice Strong. He's the co-organizer. Yeah. So who's Maurice Strong? So growing up, this is a guy who's working as a securities analyst in Winnipeg, Canada. In 1948, he meets Nelson Rockefeller in New York, and they get along great. So Nelson introduces Strong to the United Nations and introduces him around there. Strong goes back to Canada, interestingly becomes the YMCA secretary in Calgary. He's getting involved in humanitarian circles and Rockefeller's philanthropies, and he's starting to play in those games. He doesn't have this kind of background. He didn't grow up a muckety muck, but he became one. So after a decade of doing that, Maurice Strong, up to 1959, joined something called Dome Petroleum. That's a Canadian oil company. And of course, their largest shareholder is the Rockefellers. And he starts managing the Rockefeller oil investments. Remember the guy last week that was managing all the Rockefeller investments? This guy's right alongside him. In 1966, he becomes the president of something called Power Corporation of Canada, and that's also part of the Rockefeller Energy Network. So his whole background's in energy and oil, right? In the 1960s, he transitions to what's called, quote, public service. He joins something, tell me if this sounds familiar, the Canadian International Development Agency.
Oh my gosh.
Uh-huh.
We've got the Canadian version of USAID.
Pretty much.
Okay.
Right around the same time, too, early 60s.
Yes.
And of course, CIDA, the Canadian Intelligence Development Agency, big collaborator with the Rockefeller Foundation. And a lot of the work they did was once again, air quotes, rural development in Africa. Now, I'll pause there and let you comment on what's going on in Africa in the 1960s as we're getting through decolonization.
Well, we actually weren't getting through decolonization. We were transitioning colonization from an overt to a covert methodology. Instead of overtly having the people in Africa enslaved, we were going to enslave them economically, security-wise, and every other way other than the traditional, we are going to be occupying the presidential palace. So what they did was they sponsored someone that they could control into the presidential palace, kept them under tight control, and infiltrated all of the infrastructures in all of these quote unquote newly freed countries in order to continue stealing all of their resources.
Exactly. And this guy, Maurice Strong, is doing that for the benefit of mankind, obviously.
Well, some men. in the Northeast and in London.
Very good. All right. So who said it in chat? Conscious Being said Club of Rome too. Absolutely. Well done. 1968. He's one of the founding members of the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome basically had this. Basically, it's another depopulation club, and there's 100 members at all times, supported by the Rockefellers. One of the other founding members was Herman Kahn, who we just mentioned. David Rockefeller, Nelson's brother, is one of the founding members of the Club of Rome. They're the ones who wrote the book in, once again, 1971 called Limits to Growth, where they basically this goes back to Thomas Malthus's theory, and I've pulled this up before. They said human population goes up this fast, and our ability to create resources only goes up this fast. Therefore, we're going to run out of resources, and we're all going to be savages. It's going to be anarchy, cats and dogs eating each other. That's basically the whole Malthusian depopulation cult, and its Club of Rome decides to formalize it. Basically, they said in the Limits of Growth that humanity would overshoot the Earth's carrying capacity by the year 2150. They've changed that number around quite a bit, depending on where it's politically convenient. But that's the Club of Rome. And this guy, Maurice Strong, is there. So 1970, Strong gets appointed as the Under-Secretary General to the United Nations for the 1972 Stockholm Conference. Let me ask you this question. Why is an oil exec, sponsored by the Rockefellers, who own more oil resources than anybody else, so involved in setting up this whole worldwide climate movement that's anti-oil? I mean, seriously, why are these people so involved in trying to stop the use of oil and fossil fuels?
Well, I don't think they're interested in stopping it. They're interested in controlling it.
Yeah, you create the artificial scarcity. I think I've said this on your show before, that the first time we ever heard of peak oil was from John David Rockefeller in the 1870s. That's where that theory is. If there's a limited supply, your price goes up. But use the word control. And I'll take it a step further than what you just said. This whole climate scam is part of the New World Order's Great Reset theory to basically wipe out, once again, 95% of the population, because they've got control of the resources. They'll keep enough of us alive, of us useless eaters alive, to do their menial labor if the robots can't do it. And this is exactly what was on the Georgia Guidestones that were blown up a couple of years ago. They've told us in their own writing what they're trying to do.
And keep in mind that if your plan is to control Earth, you are going to want to keep what you know to be the most efficient energy over here. And if I can, in one of the ways that I control Earth is to steal the wealth of the middle class and make them all useless eaters, so that they're easier to control. If I can create this figment of your imagination, another hologram called green energy, and I can use this nebulous green energy bullshit made up thing that I am going to craft through my intelligence agencies and these think tanks to be this shiny object over here. And by doing that, it's literally a vacuum cleaner. It goes to every country around the world and it sucks up the wealth of all of those countries, all of their resources, everything, into this magic vacuum that they own. So now they have all of the oil and they have all of our wealth. That's
and they get the wealth. Yeah. And I'm not going to go into this today. We should do a whole show on this, but part of the scam is the whole climate, the carbon credit. They're creating a $5 trillion artificial market. Well, they will own the climate exchanges. And friendly reminder that the Chicago Climate Exchange, one of their initial shareholders was none other than Barack Obama.
Yes.
Yeah. I got to point out another hilarious comment in the chat on Rumble. Major Sarge says, the author of the U.S. nuclear strategy was also a depopulationist. What could possibly go wrong? Sorry, that cracked me up.
Yes, he's very good.
Yeah. All right, that's pretty good. Okay, where am I here? All right, 1970. Okay. 1970, Maurice Strong gets appointed to the Undersecretary General for this big 1972 Stockholm conference that launches this entire green movement. Okay, it came from the United Nations. It came from the Rockefellers. At the time, Nelson Rockefeller was the governor of New York, and his brother David is the chair of Chase Manhattan. So they got the political and the financial angles going on this. In 72, Strong becomes the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Human Environment. In 72, he leads something called UNEP, which is the United Nations Environmental Program, and that was in Nairobi, Kenya. He's out there doing his propaganda. In 1976, he heads something called the Ontario Hydro and Petro Canada. He was pulled back from the working at the UN to go back to private, and the guy who requested him to do that was none other than Pierre Trudeau, the father of our little favorite angry imp from Canada,
our little Nazi up there.
Yeah. He then becomes the chairman of the World Alliance of YMCAs. So why does the YMCA keep showing up in our research?
Because it is also like the Peace Corps that has been infiltrated because it's everywhere and it is used as a cover for the CIA.
Bingo. So I thought that was worthy of mention. Then comes one of the biggest events in human history was the 1992 Earth Council in Rio de Janeiro. And that's when the whole world got blasted with his climate propaganda. Excuse me. Maurice Strong is the longtime foundation director of the World Economic Forum. And to remind you, World Economic Forum was founded in 1971 by a gentleman by the name of Klaus Schwab, who also happened to be a disciple of the Rockefellers. And they're the ones who preached the Great Reset. Starting to see a pattern here yet, Colonel?
Yes, I see a big pattern.
So,
but are you done with this one yet?
No, I got a few more on him, and it gets really good. Do you want to wait?
Right.
Or okay?
No, go ahead. Yeah, because I want to go back to the Sweden connection when you're done.
Go ahead and do that now. That's not going to knock me off.
Well, the reason why Sweden is so important is because obviously you have the Rockefeller kind of counterpart of the Wallenberg family in Sweden. They're the defense industry. They're in, communications everywhere. A huge. So it is not coincidental that they're hosting these things in Sweden. That wasn't some random selection site. Just wanted to put that out there.
No, that's a great point. I appreciate you doing that. We were actually talking about the Wallenbergs this week on X a few times, and there's a couple of people with the Erickson report by Michael Ray Curry. I had Michael Ray on a show a couple of years ago. He's a great guy. Michael Ray has done a lot of work on the Wallenbergs. I think he's gone deeper in that than anybody else. So if you want to check that out, go look for the Erickson report. And that'll completely back up what the Colonel just said. And it goes to some scary places. All right, so let me just finish up Maurice Strong, because he's one of my favorite people in history. He sits on the advisory council. Well, first of all, he's a senior advisor at the World Bank. Why is that so interesting? Remember when we talked about the director of the World Bank sitting on the Warren Commission, a guy by the name of John J. McCloy?
Yes.
Yeah, well, this guy's Maurice Strong's on his advisory council. And what is the World Bank doing in investigating an assassination anyway?
Well, the World Bank, unlike most people think, is one of the tentacles of the post-World War II perpetual colonialization infrastructure. So you have the intelligence piece, you have the economic piece. The World Bank and the IMF control the economic piece. They're the ones that puts the noose out there for the CIA-controlled prime minister to give him the $10 billion loan. And then when he pockets, $1 billion of it for him and his family, and another $1 billion of it goes into a trust fund for the CIA, another $1 billion goes over here and here, then the citizens of that colonialized country get saddled with the $10 billion debt. And then you have another element that comes around and goes, hey, you want to get rid of that debt? I'm going to take over all your national parks and blah, blah, blah. So the World Bank is part of this entire manipulation structure. So the fact that you find a guy that's manipulating the structure at a place that manipulates the structure is not surprising to anyone.
And the fact that he's basically setting up all this climate stuff sitting right next door to a Skull and Bones member is no coincidence whatsoever. The World Bank came out of the World Bank came out of the Bretton Woods Agreement from 1944. We've talked about that quite a bit, Bretton Woods. And that's basically the Anglo-American rules-based order that they put in place before World War II is even over. And that's what we're living under today. So really good. So Maurice Strong is on the advisory council of a few interesting things. One is the Center of International Development at Harvard. The other is the World Business Council for, wait for it, Sustainable Development. And don't you just know it? He's on the advisory council of the World Wildlife Fund.
That's where I know his name from.
Really? I got him. Yeah, I ran into him when I was looking into the climate garbage, but originally.
Yeah, no, we came across him when we did that big deep dive on the World Wildlife Fund. Because let's just go back to my scenario, because I forgot about him being on it. So the scenario of the World Bank going in and giving these basically loans to these CIA installed dictators, and then the IMF and the World Bank circles around and says, hey, you can't pay them back. We want your natural forest, or we want your whatever. Well, do you know who steps in and does that? The World Wildlife Fund. The World Wildlife Fund is the entity that goes to that dictator and says, hey, we'll take over the management, and we're also going to fund the national police in your park services. And then they turn those parks into real estate investments of their buddies. That's, the guy that's doing the eco-friendly hotel. They kicked all the indigenous people off the national forested land that had lived there for 1,000 years. And they're going to build an eco-friendly hotel. And I'm not even lying. They did this in the Serengeti. And then they took the tourists that came to their eco-friendly hotel that's not eco-friendly at all because it's running generators in the middle of the forest. And then they put them on a bus and they take them to the new temporary village for these indigenous people and have them dance for the tourist. They literally did that. That is what the World Wildlife Fund is all about. It is one of the most hideous things I've ever seen. And I also noticed that he's in charge, or he's at least part of, the African American Institute. That's another one of those exploitive organizations that I'm in the middle of revealing right now. And it says right now, if you just click on that, it says it is a CIA front. And this guy is part of it, or was part of it.
Interesting. Fun stuff. I thought Maurice deserved a little bit. Okay, so he got in a little bit of trouble in 2005. You remember the oil for food scandal?
Yes.
He got like a $988,000 check from a Jordanian bank. And that's when basically they were rigging the oil for food stuff to get money to Saddam Hussein.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this guy was involved in that. And that's kind of how he fell out of favor in the United Nations. Maurice Strong would then kind of leave and go live in China for the next decade before he died. I'm not a morbid person, but in 2015, when he died, friendless and penniless or whatever in China, I raised a toast because I was already all about Maurice Strong. This is one of my supervillains. I've always been, So I'm glad we got to intersect him today, but he's gone. Thank you.
So do you honestly think that he died penniless?
I don't know if he died penniless. I know he wasn't allowed in a lot of countries. It was kind of exiled to China.
And isn't it weird that he ends up in China? I thought they were our enemy.
Well, here's where it gets interesting. Remember we talked about 1971. Isn't that the same year that Rockefeller stooge Kissinger went to China to open up China to the West?
Yes, it is.
Would it surprise you to know that the Chinese CCP and the former Soviets, CCP funded a bunch of our green movements in America, and the Soviets funded a bunch of the European green movement?
No, it would not surprise me at all because I think the same people that created all of those things created all of our bad things too, right?
Yeah, in my mind, this is the Rockefellers and associates sitting up there pulling the puppet strings, opening up China, saying, how are we going to destroy the West? How are we going to get the West to destroy itself, more importantly? And we've seen this plan in action, the Great Reset. Let's talk about the four horsemen of the apocalypse from 1971 of the Rockefellers. And it's Maurice Strong, it is Klaus Schwab, it is Henry Kissinger, and it is Brzezinski. Those are the four that put all these pieces in place. And you can see the whole playbook follow for the last 50 years.
Yeah, so I'm not at all surprised that he was protected, shielded over in China.
No, not at all. Back to our friend Kellogg. A couple other things about him before we move on. He actually teamed up with Carl Sagan, I guess you'd say it, yeah, on the National Academy of Sciences Space Science Board, sat on the President's Science Advisory Committee, and also on NASA's Advisory Council. So this is a bonesman who's been basically involved in every single bit of that for, up until his death. Nice guy, huh?
Yeah, I see he wrote a paper with Margaret Mead too.
Oh, I didn't catch that.
Yeah, the atmosphere, endangered the endangering.
So we've got a feminist and a climate alarmist writing papers together. If that's not social engineering, I don't know what is.
Yes, exactly. Both of them RAND buddies.
Yeah, you guys want to know where the woke religion came from? We just pointed it out to you. It's right there.
Yep, all created
by Bonesman and Rockefeller disciples. All right, we've got a new guy we want to look at.
Okay.
And this guy's picture needs to be shown because he was very famous at one point in time. Hang on. I don't know why it does that to me. I'm using multiple screens. It sometimes shifts around. This is a gentleman by the name of Barry Zorinthian. Armenian, you can tell. So why is he important? Well, we're going to talk about that. So Barry Zorinthian is how you pronounce it. Skull and Bones, 1941. He's an Armenian born in Turkey. Family moves to New Haven, Connecticut. His dad was just a worker as a dry cleaner. But the war comes after he gets tapped to be Skull and Bones in 41, and he joins the Marines. So here's where it gets fun. He goes to work for CBS Radio and Voice of America.
So he's a CIA guy.
Well, yes. Do you want to remind everyone who Voice of America is, or is that going to be self-evident as I talk about that? Yeah, go ahead and give a quick overview of VOA.
Well, I mean, basically, Voice of America, they've had Radio Liberty. They've had a whole bunch of different iterations of this. It is a CIA propaganda tool that they deploy anytime that they're prepping an area for overthrow. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. They had one in Europe. They had one projected at the Eastern Europe. They had one projected at the Soviet Union. They set up one in Asia when they were doing the World Anti-Communist League garbage. They did it in South America. As a matter of fact, I did an entire thread on Swan Island. Swan Island was, it was set up, radio similar to that was set up to pipe into Cuba. So it is a tentacle of propaganda that's all orchestrated out of the CIA.
The CIA that's founded by a bunch of Skull and Bones alumni.
That same one.
Yeah, and this Barry Zorinthian is going to be he's basically the face of a lot of the things you just said. He just happens, just coincidentally, is the Skull and Bones alumni. It's just got to be totally random that these people all end up in the same position.
Totally.
Yeah. Can you guys smell can you see the sarcasm dripping out of my microphone? So while he's doing that, he gets his law degree, going to night school at NYU. This guy's an overachiever. 1948, he covers the Korean War is one of the very first of the Voice of America overseas correspondents. He's one of the pioneers.
The war didn't even start until 50. What the hell is he doing over there in 48? Prepping the battlefield?
Well, exactly right. In fact, this guy actually was a co-author of the Voice of America's charter, and he would later serve as the program director. So he's yeah. This is the poster child for the CIA's propaganda arm.
Yeah, it sounds like it. He's over there in 1948 setting the conditions for what doesn't even happen until 1950. Holy shit.
Well, he really got famous because for 4 years, he was the chief spokesperson for the U.S. government in Saigon in South Vietnam from 1964 to 68. This is the guy. Remember the 5 o'clock follies?
Yeah.
That's the guy. This is Barry Zorthian.
This is the guy.
Yeah, that's the one. We all knew about him. What is it? Good Morning Vietnam, when Robin Williams did that movie?
Yes. Yes.
He was being parodied. The lack of transparency. He's trying to report. Who is it? I got the quote here, and I can't remember who said it, but his problem was he's trying to sell a bad war to the American public. He's trying to convince us. This is Baghdad Bob of Vietnam. Everything he says is a lie, and he didn't have a choice. So he becomes the press media advisor to 3 U.S. ambassadors to South Vietnam, including Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who you know and love, and General Westmoreland. That's Mr. Zorthian. He'd then go on to oversee a 500-person joint U.S. Public Affairs under a guy named Carl T. Rowan, who I know you've run into.
Yeah.
After Vietnam, where does he go? Well, he becomes an executive at Time magazine.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
I'm sorry. Of course he does. Another CIA arm.
Yeah, remind our audience who founded Time magazine once again.
Luce?
Henry Luce. And what fraternal organization was he a part of in college?
Oh, I don't know. Have we talked about it at all?
Could it be something with like skull and crossbones, something like that? Yeah.
Holy shit, this is so funny. In a horrible way. And because, again, let's just bring it up. Where was the Zapruder film found? In Luce's safe.
What was interesting was when the Pentagon Papers came out in 1971, my favorite year. Zorthia calls the Vietnam War the most open war in history.
Oh my God, are you kidding me?
Yeah. Even ABC News laughed at him, citing, Elliot Bernstein was laughing at him, said, really, what about the American bombing in Laos? What about the bases in Thailand you never told us about? It's not an open war. All this hidden stuff that the Colonel talks about with Operation Gladio and Project Phoenix and all that stuff, Zorthian is a guy that kept hiding that, and he called it the most open war in history. So screw this liar.
He's the biggest liar in history.
He's up there with Baghdad Bob. So he retires as a Marine Corps Reserve as a colonel in 1973. So he was in the reserves apparently the whole time which is interesting to me. From 90 to 94, he's a member of oversight of the Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. So this whole propaganda arm that he helped co-found 30 years earlier, he's still overseeing it into the 90s.
And what's important about those dates?
Well, that's when the Gulf War starts. That's when the Berlin Wall falls and the Gulf War begins.
Correct. So 1990 to 94, we're transitioning from the communist boogeyman to the radical Islamist terrorist. And this guy is overseeing the propaganda part of that on the oversight committee for Europe. It is also during that time that Operation Gladio breaks, so that it all has to be hidden by the same media apparatus so that people in America don't even get to hear about it.
Yep, this is one of the fathers of American propaganda, and the last couple things I'm gonna hammer that home in these last couple points. He had a famous quote about the 91 Gulf War. He said, "The war is over and the press lost," which is pretty funny. In the 90s, he basically is the president of something called the Public Diplomacy Foundation. And in 2009, he's a consultant for a lobbyist firm called Alcade and Fay. And that shouldn't be a household name, but what they did is they basically participated in the review of the Smith-Mundt Act. And when they modernized it in 2013, this guy was the one who helped write the paper, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2013, that modernized, air quotes, the Smith-Mundt Act, which now allows Americans to use propaganda on U.S. soil, the American agencies. And that was a big friggin' deal. So this guy, the father of our foreign propaganda, helped write the paper that allowed our intelligence agencies to use propaganda on domestic soil under Obama's administration. That's your guy.
That's crazy.
Uh-huh. Anybody heard of Barry Zorthian before? Oh, he had to be, I guess anybody who paid attention during Vietnam would have known him, but he never showed up in my textbooks growing up.
And it also says that he was the executive director of the International Climate Change Partnership.
Zorthian was?
Yes.
I didn't have that. Holy crap. Everything comes full circle again.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. The Fay guy, where he went to work. Where he went to work, that lobbying firm.
Oh.
They were in charge of the International Climate Change Partnership. So that may have been a reason why he went to work there too.
No, there's no shocker at all. It's all part of the same. It's all part of the same giant grift. And this Alcade and Fay is a giant DC lobbyist, or not giant, but they're very influential to say the least.
Yeah, it says that. It says co-founder Fay said that the firm was had grown to be the largest maritime practice in Washington, D.C.
Interesting.
They also, it says Alcade and Fay represented, let's see, where did I just see that? Something they covered up for McCain. Where did I just see that? In 2008, a New York Times article suggested that Alcade and Fay lobbyist Vicky Eisman was involved in an inappropriate relationship with Senator John McCain, which caused McCain to favor Eisman's communication clients in matters before the Senate Commerce Committee that he chaired.
Ah, goodness. No shock here. I mean, the more we see these connections and the corruption over and over again, it gets funny.
In a very sick and perverted way, it's funny.
Yeah. I just asked Grok to give me a list of the notable alumni of Alcade and Fay, and the third one that came up besides the founders was Vicky Eisman, what you just mentioned.
Yeah.
And the fifth one listed is Barry Zorthian, who we're just going over. Who's James Dyer? Do I know him? Clerk for the House Appropriations Committee. Yeah. That's how Washington, D.C. works. And we know this. It's not what you know, it's who you know.
Absolutely.
So that's all I have on him. I've got another name to jump into. We're about an hour in.
Okay.
But this next one's going to it'll probably take a full 30 minutes. Do you want to do it now or do you want to waste it? It's David Acheson, Dean Acheson's son.
Okay, let's go.
You want to do it?
Yep.
All righty. Buckle up.
Okay.
Give me 1 second to pull up Mr. Acheson's picture. Here he is. So this picture is of Dean Acheson. And if you followed the Colonel and myself, his name comes up quite a bit. His son is David Acheson. We're going to talk about both of them. But I love the mustache. I thought it was worth pulling up. This is a classic 1940s business look, huh?
Yeah.
I don't know. Can you tell I haven't shaved in about 4 days?
You know, he looks like Walt Disney, right?
That's a good call. I was trying to think about who he reminded me of.
Yeah, he looks like Walt Disney with that mustache.
Yeah, that's actually pretty good. They'd be about the same age too, right?
Yeah. Oh,
All right.
don't. I didn't mean that for anybody to think we were cloning these people. Somebody's going to run off with that comment. That is not what I meant. I'm just making an observation. Go ahead.
So David Atchison, who's not worth showing the picture of, actually, it was really hard to find his pictures. There's a bunch of David Atchisons in the world, and I didn't know which one I was looking at. I was in a hurry, so I didn't pull his picture. But he's a bonesman of 1943. His father, who we just looked at, is Dean Atchison, and we have talked about him a bunch. And I'm going to go through Dean relatively quickly and just stop me.
Okay.
When we go. So when we had an episode about 4 episodes ago, we talked about the wise men, where they talked about the 6 wise men that shaped the American foreign policy post-World War II. That's Dean Atchison. He's one of the 6 quote-unquote wise men. And his daughter, David's brother, married William Bundy, who we talked about earlier. Why is Bundy important? Because the Bundy family is all over Skull and Bones too.
Correct.
So Dean Atchison, his son is a bonesman. His daughter marries a bonesman. Dean himself was not, but apparently he was. The reason that David was not, the reason Dean was not, well, I went to a high school at another private boarding school called the Groton School. Goes to Yale, not in Skull and Bones, because he's in Scroll and Key, one of the 2 other big secret societies. Want to guess where he went to law school?
Yeah.
Another Skull and Bones.
Oh, Harvard. Sorry. Yeah, Harvard.
Yeah, straight to Harvard Law.
Yeah.
Dean Atchison would, after Harvard Law, he would study under Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, who we've talked about before. And then he would clerk for Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. Yeah. What does Dean Atchison do next?
Whoa. Hold on just a second.
Yeah.
That's one in. Wonder if the Wycliffe College in Toronto is connected to the Wycliffe College in the U.S. because the Wycliffe College in the U.S. is the one that Nelson Rockefeller used to embed all of the CIA prior to the CIA, but the spies in to go down and rat out all the indigenous Indians in South America. But I noticed he went to Wycliffe College. Dean did.
Interesting.
Or no, I'm sorry. His dad did. Sorry.
Got it. I didn't go into his dad.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, then he goes to, after clerks for 2 Supreme Court justices. So this guy's moving in some pretty rarefied circles, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So which law firm does he show up at? Oh, I don't know. Covington and Burling.
What?
Uh-huh. So let's talk about Covington and Burling for a second, because they just got their security clearances stripped by Donald Trump because they were helping work on all of the lawfare stuff. In 2025,
they're the ones that railroaded Mike Flynn.
Yeah, not only let's just roast Covington and Burling, because Trump just pulled their entire security clearance for the whole firm because they gave $140,000 of free consultation to Jack Smith witch hunt. That's Covington and Burling. But let's talk about some of their alumni. William Bundy. Who's that? Skull and Bones. The Queen of Death, Victoria Nuland, came from Covington and Burling. Yeah, the one who started the whole Ukraine thing, made that phone call with Jeffrey Pyatt, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, and said, who are we going to pick when we overthrow Yanukovych? That's Covington and Burling attorney, Victoria Nuland. How about Dana Remus, the White House counsel for Barack Obama? Well, here's a fun one. Paul Tagliabue, the commissioner of the NFL. Lanny Brewer. John Bolton, the warmonger himself, and Obama's wingman, Eric Holder. That's Covington and Burling, and that's where Dean Atchison went and worked.
And Togo West, who ran the VA for them. Yeah. Oh, this is a whole mess. Holy crap. Michael Chernoff. Holy shit.
Yeah, that's one of these law firms that is just everywhere.
Wow.
Thanks, Donnie Vision. Appreciate that. Just said we're on fire today. Here's a fun one from Covington and Burling. In 2008, they have an alliance with something called the Institution Quraysh for Law and Policy. That is a Qatari-based transnational law firm and think tank. The Qataris are in bed with a law firm that employs or employed all of these national security people in D.C. working side by side with the Qataris. Do you see a problem there?
Yes, I do, because Qatar is not, I mean, that's a whole show in and of itself, because that's where U.S. Central Command decided, weirdly enough, to put their forward command center. So we're tied at the hip to them, and they hate us.
You mean the same Qatar where the all the Hamas leaders live?
Yes.
That one? Oh, yeah.
Why would we put our command center there unless we want the entire thing compromised, which it is?
I just love the fact that this Covington and Burling is really in partnership with a Qatari think tank. And while they're employing pretty much the who's who of the national security apparatus over the last 30 years.
Yes.
Well, that's where that's where our boy Dean Acheson went to work. So after that, of course, with that glorious background, FDR appoints him to be the Undersecretary of the Treasury in 1933. But he sent him packing immediately because he opposed the New Deal economics. Somehow FDR, well, that's good. These people aren't all evil or all stupid. I mean, I would have agreed with Dean Acheson in 1933. The New Deal was very socialist, and we are not a socialist country. But FDR forgives him somehow, and he becomes named in 1941 as the war is breaking out. He gets named as the Assistant Secretary of State. This is the guy, Dean Acheson. He is all over everything in America's post-war plans or during the war. He's the guy who implements FDR's foreign aid to the United Kingdom. He's the guy who implements the Lend-Lease program where we armed the Russians. He's the guy who suggested and implemented the American, British, and Dutch embargo of oil to Japan, which many cite is the reason Japan was forced to go to war in World War II.
Correct.
That's Dean Acheson. And if you remember the three countries I just named, America, the Dutch, and the British. So you're talking about Standard Oil, you're talking about Royal Dutch Shell.
Correct.
And BP. These are the same oil companies that helped carve up the Middle East. Yes. They were these three powerhouses. That's Dean Acheson for you. He's the one of the causes of Japan bombing Pearl Harbor, because that policy, when Japan doesn't have its own oil. They're a modern industrial company. If you tell them you can't have any oil.
So you're telling me that a Skull and Bones guy started World War II, a war?
Scroll and Key. This guy was not Skull and Bones. His son was. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So they spread the blame a little bit.
Yeah. Okay.
They probably
made him go there, so Skull and Bones didn't get it.
No. But they got his kid, and they got his daughter. What else did he do? Oh, Dean Acheson in 1944 attended something called the Bretton Woods Conference.
The World Bank and the IMF.
Not only, also he's the guy who helped draft what's called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which became something known as the World Trade Organization. That's the guy.
Yeah.
And just to remind everybody, I'm literally maybe an hour away from Bretton Woods right this minute, where all that stuff went down. It's where they plotted the entire Anglo-American rules-based order that we live under today.
That's crazy.
Yeah, he becomes Undersecretary of State in 1946. He's the guy who pushed for détente with USSR. He argued American intervention in China would fail. And he's the guy that was blamed for the loss of China. When was MacArthur that wanted to take out the commies in China in 1949? Acheson didn't want that to happen. And so when we, quote unquote, lost China, Acheson got a lot of bad publicity. So then he becomes the Secretary of State, 1949 to 1953. What happened in those years?
From when? To win
49 to 53. Any
the
kind of
Korean War.
bingo. That's Atchison. He'd go on. Previously, he'd helped design what was called the Truman Doctrine and also the Marshall Plan. And he's one of the masterminds of the creation of something called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO. That's Dean Acheson. So he gets comes under attack from Senator McCarthy during the Red Scare for being too pro-China, and he refused to turn on Alger Hiss. So he got caught in that. He apparently got a bit of a pro-China bent reputation. Apparently, and his actions appear to be somewhat consistent with that. I bring that up because we were just talking about China and the Rockefellers. Well, he resigns from the State Department in 1953, and he becomes sits on the board of trustees of Yale University, of course. And sitting right next to him on that board of trustees is Skull and Bones alumni that we talked about earlier, Robert A. Taft, who used to be a critic of his. Dean Acheson and Taft end up being sitting side by side, even though they used to be on opposite sides of the aisle. His law firm that he worked at, the office was only a few blocks from the White House for like 2 decades. So he could just walk into the White House anytime he wanted. Dean Acheson advised JFK on the Cuban Missile Crisis. He advised LBJ to negotiate peace in Vietnam. That's Dean Acheson. One of the most important and powerful figures of the 20th century. Anything you want to add on Dean?
No, I think you pretty much covered it.
Yeah, that's one of the guys. So his son, David, is a Skull and Bones. What's interesting about the Acheson family, or David, is I think from his mother's side, he's descendant of a big Canadian distiller called Gooderham. And it's a big distiller. And of course, they made their money in, of course, prohibition, working with the mafia.
Of course.
Yeah. So he gets David is it's pretty hard to keep up with his dad, but he did a decent job. I mean, he did some stuff that matters. So let's see how quickly I can get through this. Went to Groton School, private school, 1939. Skull and Bones, 1940s. Was ROTC at Yale. Guess where he went to law school?
Harvard.
Of course. 1942, he goes to the U.S. Naval Reserve for the war, and he serves until 46 in the Pacific Theater. You want to guess where he served? I won't make you do that. Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and of course the Philippines.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh, he was there with Singleb, where they were creating all of the little assassins that they're going to use later on in Korea and Vietnam.
He's also there for Operation Golden Lily.
Ooh. Huh. That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Kind of coincidence how these people all show up in the same places, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right. So at 48, he's out of the Navy, and he works as an attorney for, how about the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission?
Because of course.
Because of course we have Skull and Bones and basically run our whole nuclear program at this point.
Right.
Yes. I mean, why not? I mean, you just couldn't pick a guy that went to, I don't know, school at UCLA. You got to get a bonesman for every one of these damn positions. So in 61 to 65, he's a U.S. attorney for the D.C. District Court, which shouldn't exist, but we're not going to do that today. In 1965, remember his father worked with LBJ?
Mm-hmm.
In 65, LBJ names him a special assistant to the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Fowler.
Oh.
Guess which law firm Henry Fowler worked at? Covington and Burling.
Of course. Oh my God. Maybe we should do a whole show on Covington and Burling.
I don't know if I could do it without getting sick to my stomach.
Without getting sick? Okay. All right.
Tough one. So as his job working as a special assistant to the Treasury Secretary, he's responsible for coordinating the Treasury's law enforcement activity, and that includes the Secret Service, the Bureau of Narcotics, the Bureau of Customs, the Coast Guard, and the IRS.
Huh. So all domestic terrorist organizations he's in charge of.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
The Coast Guard was interesting to me, but we talked about these are covert intelligence agents that are smuggling narcotics into America that are alumni of the same fraternity of the guy who's enforcing.
Correct.
Yeah, that's kind of the point I was trying to drive home there, awkwardly. So interestingly, he goes back to private practice after that with a company called Jones Day. It's called Jones Day, Rivas and Poe. He's there from 74 to 78. Now, Jones Day is a very interesting law firm, big time. They represented about half the companies in the S&P 500 at one point or the other. They've also just focused their law practice on the Republican Party since 2000. So they're a Republican law firm, and they actually represented Trump's campaign in 2024. So that's Jones Day, who he worked for, Atchison, in 74 to 78. So these guys always cover both sides of the aisle.
Yes.
When they say there's a uniparty, that's exactly it's how that happens. So he worked for a company, for a firm. Then he would go for 78, goes to work for a firm, David Atchison does, called Drinker, Biddle, and Reith. That's actually the law firm that helped create J.P. Morgan and Company back in the day. In 1991 and 92, David Atchison becomes a consultant to the Atlantic Council.
CIA itself.
Yes. Pretty amazing. Oh, and by 93, he becomes the president and CEO of the Atlantic Council, which, of course, is considered a think tank, again, in international affairs. What's funny about the Atlantic Council, it's founded in 1961 by two people, among others, Dean Acheson, his father, and David Rockefeller, of all people, founded the Atlantic Council. 30 years later, Dean Acheson's son is the CEO of the think tank. So this is how incestuous our country is. They do not go outside the family. David Acheson would lobby for the TTIP trade program, which is awful. So let's talk about the Atlantic Council real quick, because that's a big deal. Who are their famous members?
Every former CIA director.
Yeah, I'm going to go relatively quick, but just stop me when you want to. Kristen Herter is one of the co-founders with Dean Acheson. And of course, he was the U.S. Secretary of State from 59 to 61.
59 to 61. Okay. So at the end of Eisenhower.
Yeah. Some more Atlantic Council members. Oh, I don't know. Henry Kissinger, U.S. Secretary of State. Guy by the name of James Jones, National Security Advisor. How about Chuck Hagel, Secretary of Defense? Former Republican presidential candidate John Huntsman, who, of course, was the U.S. ambassador to China in 2009 to 11 and the U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2017 to 2019. Again, Atlantic Council. How about a few more? How about Susan Rice?
Mm-hmm.
National Security Advisor and UN Ambassador under Obama. Richard Holbrooke, U.S. Special Representative for, get it, Afghanistan and Pakistan. So this is a think tank, allegedly, and every single one of their alumni are sitting on basically every State Department bottleneck position you could think of, all from one think tank.
Yes.
Yeah, our foreign policy isn't supposed to be done privately, but this is what we're describing here.
Yes.
How about Michael Hayden? Yeah, the CIA director from 2006 to 2009. Also the National Security Advisor from 99 to 2005. And this is the guy who shaped the intel policy during the War on Terror, which basically means he's the one who lied about the weapons of mass destruction.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we couldn't have an good Atlantic Council without Michael Morrell, CIA director 2011 to 2013. This is the guy who decided when they're shifting policy to start targeting Russia and Iran. That's Michael Morrell. Well, of course, Condoleezza Rice has to make another appearance because she is an Atlanta Council member and she was a Secretary of State from 05 to 09 and National Security Advisor from 01 to 05. So she worked. This is George Bush's seconds, you know. And I have to mention one of my favorite Atlanta Council members was one Dmitry Alperovich. You remember that name?
Yes.
All right. For those who don't remember Dmitry Alperovich, he's one of the co-founders of CrowdStrike. Who's CrowdStrike? That was the cybersecurity company that investigated the DNC hack in 2015-16 that basically attributed to the Russians that we all think was not a hack. It might have been a leak by a certain person named Seth Rich. CrowdStrike falsely attributed it. The FBI never investigated that quote-unquote hack. Well, CrowdStrike's got a terrible, terrible record. They're the ones who came up with this idea that Fancy Bear, it was a Russian hacking thing, they made that attribution. It was basically saying the Russians were hacking Ukrainian weapon systems and communications. It didn't happen. They were wrong. CrowdStrike's also the one that falsely attributed the Sony hack to North Korea, and that's not who did it. So they've gotten everything wrong. One of the other main people at CrowdStrike, and I bring this up, is a guy by the name of Sean Henry. He was their chief security officer. Why does this matter? Because he worked directly under James Comey when he was at the FBI up until like 2014. So you've got the CrowdStrike attributing to Russia the Seth Rich leak, a guy who used to work for the FBI under James Comey, and then Comey's investigating the damn thing. So there's your Russiagate. Let's see. Oh, okay. Let's just finish it up with this. The Atlanta Council has to have sponsors, right?
Can I talk about one more real quick?
Please.
General Shinzeki, which everybody that served during my time would know who he is. I just was looking at the ones who left to go into the Obama administration. He was the VA person. He was a retired 4-star. I just noticed, I did not know this. Guess where he grew up? In Hawaii on a sugar plantation. I'm sorry. All right, go ahead.
Nice. No, that's can't make this stuff up. Okay, let's look at some of the sponsors of the Atlanta Council. Who funds all this operation of the people that have set American foreign policy for the last, 25 years minimum, 30? Well, of course, the U.S. government gives them a lot of money.
A lot.
But they also receive donations from more than 25 other foreign nations. So let that think in. Let that sink in. We've got a think tank called the Atlanta Council that alumni are shaping American foreign policy for decades, and they're accepting donations from other countries. Do you think they may have some conflicts of interest, just a little bit?
Because this is a NATO think tank. It is not a U.S. think tank.
Yeah, but they just happen to have their people as our Secretary of State, ahead of NSA. Yeah, that's ridiculous. Our country's not been run by patriots; it's been run by globalists. That's Correct. The point we're making here, and it's right there in our face. Now, of course, that their private funders, the two biggest ones, are the Rockefeller Foundation and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, because of course they are. The Atlanta Council gets money from the United Arab Emirates because, of course, they do. Another big private funder is Facebook and Meta. United Kingdom, of course, gets a mention. Lockheed Martin, defense contractor that's funding the company that shapes foreign policy. Any conflict of interest there?
A little bit.
Yeah. Let's see. More war means more profit.
Correct.
So I'm going to send money to the think tank that'll give me more war. Makes
Correct.
Perfect sense. Yeah. Nothing wrong with that picture at all.
And let me just point out that UAE is the country that was in bed with Saudi that created the BCCI bank. Just want to put that out there.
Did I mention
gold? All the money that goes along with the war.
Yes. There's an interesting name of a philanthropist by one of the original founders, is Adrienne Arsht, and she's a philanthropist. But her background was she worked in the legal department of Trans World Airlines, TWA.
Okay.
Well, guess where she worked? Guess where she worked with TWA? In the property, cargo, and government relations.
So she was the CIA bridge into TWA when they flew their missions.
It sure seems like it.
Okay, got it.
All right, we're going to finish this with a mic drop.
Okay.
One last major funder of the Atlantic Council is a company from a country you may have heard of called the Ukraine. This company's name is Burisma.
What?
Yeah, that's right. Burisma funded over $500,000 up to 2019. And they started funding the Atlantic Council when Burisma was trying to rehabilitate its image after the bribery probes in 2014 and 2015. So they start funding the United Council. And next thing you know, Hunter Biden's sitting on the board of Burisma.
Okay, hold on. So you're telling me that the CIA directors that all ended up at the Atlantic Council who signed the letter to impeach Trump was being funded by the company that he was telling his current CIA to investigate.
Not only that, but that's your mic drop right there. Not only that, but I'm telling you, this company, Burisma, is paying the Atlantic Council, who also has a member that co-founded CrowdStrike, who set up the entire Russia collusion hoax in the first place.
Yes.
All funnels through the Atlantic Council. And David Acheson, skull and bones, is right there smack dab in the middle of it.
Huh.
How's that for a mic drop?
Little coup d'etat there.
Just a little bit.
That's crazy.
Yeah. It's a good thing we don't have anything going on in Ukraine right now that actually could be investigated. Do you know why Zelensky, wasn't going to allow for peace? Because if you have peace in the Ukraine, we can go in there and start investigating it. He also knows he's out of a job. What I thought was hilarious about that whole fiasco on Friday, and I put this out in real time, and it looks like I was correct, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on this. It was 2 p.m. Eastern about when Zelensky got kicked out of the White House. Within an hour, over 15 foreign heads of European states had put out an almost identical statement. That is not how diplomacy works. When you're about to give a big FU to your biggest, most important diplomatic partner, the United States, you gather together with your cabinet. You make phone calls to the American embassy. This takes hours to deliver a response. And yet, 15 Europe nations within an hour released the same statement on a Friday freaking night in Europe. It was already past 8 o'clock at night and 10 o'clock in other places. And they were able to all coordinate the same thing. That whole, show on Friday was staged.
Correct.
And I think it was done for many reasons, most specifically to deny Trump a foreign policy victory, because that would help his domestic policy like you wouldn't believe. If he gets that foreign policy victory of, creating peace in the Ukraine, Trump becomes unstoppable domestically. But there's many other reasons they did that. But it's so obvious it was planned and plotted.
So obviously it was planned. And in a multi-step way, obviously, because they had to coordinate the visit here. They had to basically tell Trump that they were going to agree to it, or he would have never invited Zelensky here. And once he did his little spat in the White House with Trump, the release of those coordinated messages tells you that this entire body of international NATO alliance had schooled Zelensky in exactly what role he was to play, because they've already got step 2 coordinated, right? Which is pouncing on the release of all of these coordinated we're behind you. But I think it's much deeper than that, because I think what they're going to do, which will backfire on them, and I do hope they do it, is they're going to use the abandonment of the US to say, well, what are we going to do? We're going to have to go help because the US isn't going to help them anymore. So we want them part of NATO, so we're going to have to go help. And when they do that, it's going to create the impetus because they think they're going to rope the US into, like a backdoor way of getting us involved. Mm-hmm. Because again, you just went over World War II, how they got us involved. They used a backdoor way to get us involved by cutting off the oil to Japan. So they think that they found a backdoor way to get us involved in the Ukraine against Russia. But Trump is going to pull out of NATO. And I believe the seeds for that have already been set if you go and look at the number of congressional people that have now already suggested we don't belong in NATO anymore anyway, I think there's already an alternative narrative being set up that if these people collude to do that, to try to drag us into another war, we will exit NATO and Trump will be within his right and won't have to even defend the withdrawal at that point. Because right now, without something like this happening, how is he going to defend the withdrawal of NATO? If they do this, he has no choice but to withdraw.
How much do you want to bet that if we could get Zelensky's phone records, he's taken a few calls from people that are at the Atlantic Council in the last week?
I would not take that bet.
No. Anyways, that's all I got for today. Sorry, it was so boring. Yeah.
No, this was awesome. And I'm glad we were able to reconvene and get this out before you head off on your wonderful trip. And please give your bride my best. And I will see you when you get back following Thursday.
Yeah, I'll try to check in on Twitter, maybe catch one of your spaces if I can, if I need to, if I'm taking a nap or something like that on my vacation. But thanks for having me on, and I will look forward to chatting someday soon. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Cheers.